Today, we're going to step back in time to the American home front during World War II. But we're not going to focus on the big strategies or the major battles. Instead, we're going to see this incredible era through the eyes of just one young couple, Betty and Fred Seaver, as they try to navigate love, life, and the unbelievable anxiety of a world at war.
So, let's set the scene. It's San Diego, the summer of '43, and this city is just electric. It's been totally transformed by the war effort. It is absolutely buzzing with energy, filled to the brim with sailors, factory workers, and young families all just trying to carve out a future while the world is shrouded in uncertainty.
Okay, so let's dive right in. At the very heart of this story, we have Betty and Fred. Now, they're living in the same world as everyone else, right? A nation mobilized for a massive war, a city that's basically on the front lines of the Pacific campaign. But for them, the stakes feel even higher. They're just starting out, building a life together. And Betty's pregnant with their first child. You know, their experience, like so many others back then, was this constant, swirling mix of just everyday happiness and this deep, underlying anxiety about the war. And these two feelings, they weren't separate things. They existed side by side every single day. I mean, just picture this moment. It's late June, they're at a beach party. Betty's 5 months pregnant, and she's there with her friend Eleanor, who's almost 8 months along. It's a scene of just perfect, wonderful normalcy. Friends relaxing in the sun. And Eleanor's lighthearted comment, it just perfectly captures that simple joy, doesn't it? A little snapshot of friendship in this big shared experience.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how even these super casual conversations were kind of tinged by the uncertainty of the times. Their friend Phyllis, who's already a mom, is giving them a crash course in what to expect. And her advice just sums up the feeling of the era perfectly. Terror mixed with joy in equal measure. Honestly, that sentiment doesn't just apply to having a baby, it applies to living through the war itself.
And this is where you really feel that tension. On the one hand, you have this huge public sigh of relief when their friend George says he's been classified 4F, meaning he's safe, he's not going to be drafted. But on the other hand, there's Fred's secret private fear. He's just been reclassified 1A, which means he's eligible for service at any moment, and Betty just squeezes his hand under the table. A silent, shared secret they can't bring themselves to talk about out loud. So how did they cope with this? Well, you see this push and pull between hope and fear playing out against all these life-affirming moments. Because even with this giant war looming over everything, life, quite literally, just kept going.
So on the 4th of July, and you got to remember, fireworks were banned, rationing was in full effect, celebrations were pretty quiet. At a family picnic, Betty's father-in-law, Lyle, he just kind of puts it all into perspective. He looks around at his family and says these words, grounding this immense global conflict in the simple, powerful reality of what they were all trying to protect, right there at home.
Just a week later, Betty and Fred are celebrating their first wedding anniversary. And at the party, Betty has this sudden realization. She's looking around the room and she starts counting. Including herself, there are five visibly pregnant women right there in their close circle of friends. It was this tangible, visible sign of hope. Almost a quiet act of defiance against the future's uncertainty. And the mood of the whole thing was summed up perfectly by this joke from one of the husbands, which apparently got a huge laugh. It was this really lighthearted way of acknowledging this surprising little baby boom happening among their friends. Think about it. In a time of war and separation, these couples were choosing to build families, to create new life. And it wasn't just the women talking about it, the fathers-to-be, they all huddled together, this little bundle of nerves and excitement. They just peppered their one friend who was already a dad with question after question about what to expect. And his answer? It was brutally honest, but in the end, so reassuring. It just perfectly summed up their collective leap into the unknown. So the emotional high point of the evening really comes when Fred gives a toast. He doesn't ignore the stress or the uncertainty. Instead, he centers everything on his love for Betty and the child they're about to have. In his words, she is his home, a powerful anchor in a world that felt anything but stable. Okay, so as the summer starts to wind down, we see this major shift, this big transition for Betty, and it really symbolizes the profound change that's happening in our life and in the life of their growing family. At the end of July, Betty works her last day at the Roar aircraft factory. And it was just one of those bittersweet moments, you know? She loved her job, she loved the sense of purpose it gave her, but with the pregnancy, the long hours just became impossible. Leaving that desk for the last time really meant closing one chapter to fully, completely embrace the next, becoming a mother.
And on the drive home from their anniversary party, Betty asks Fred this incredibly poignant question. It gets right to the heart of everything they were feeling. In the future, how would they remember this time? Would they remember the joy of starting their family, or would that memory be forever shadowed by the stress and the fear of the war? Which feeling would win? And Fred's reply, it's maybe the most profound takeaway from their whole story. He doesn't try to pick one over the other. He just accepts that life, especially during these crazy, extraordinary times, is a messy, beautiful mix. The challenges and the joys, they aren't separate. They actually define each other. And so, as that summer drew to a close, Betty settled into her new life at home. The frantic pace of her job was gone, and it was replaced by a totally different kind of intensity. The intensity of just waiting. Waiting for the baby to arrive, and waiting to see what Fred's 1A draft status would mean for their future. A new, uncertain chapter had begun. You know, Betty and Fred's story, it's not just about 1943. It's really a timeless look at a universal question. When our own personal hopes and dreams and fears are all unfolding on the stage of these massive historical events, how do we find our balance? How do we hold on to joy when the world feels like it's spinning out of control? It's a question they had to live every single day, and honestly, one we still ask ourselves now.